Let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. Whisper words of wisdom, let it be.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.
Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, two strongly passionate civil rights advocates with drastically different philosophies. MLK believed in change through peaceful, nonviolent movements, while Malcolm X was far more militant and ready to achieve equality by any means necessary. Although their two movements originally conflicted, they eventually came together for the benefit of a single cause. Dr. Martin Luther King, born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, grew up and was educated in a segregated society. He graduated from a segregated Georgia high school at 15, then received a BA from Morehouse College in 1948, then studied at the Crozier Theological Seminary, and finally received his PhD from Boston University in 1955. While at the Crozier Theological Seminary, King heard a lecture about Gandhi and his nonviolent resistance. In 1955, he used Gandhi's principles to help organize the Montgomery bus boycott. In 1957, King became the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which supported his nonviolent tactics to end discrimination. In this same year, King traveled to India and came back further infatuated with Gandhian resistance strategies. King continued to be a leader for black civil rights until James Earl Ray assassinated him in 1968.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Malcolm X, born Malcolm Little, was born on May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His father, J. Early Little, was a Baptist preacher and strong supporter of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa campaign. When Malcolm was just 6 years old, his house was burned and whites murdered his father. Malcolm, influenced by this troubled childhood, grew up to be a rowdy, mischievous adolescent. He hung around in the ghettos of Boston and often committed crimes of thievery and armed robbery. This landed him in a detention home in Mason, Michigan, where Malcolm's life was changed. There, he learned to read and write and also became a supporter of Elijah Muhammad's Nation of Islam, which combined elements of traditional Islamic beliefs with black nationalist ideals.
What makes the so-called Negro unable to stand on his own two feet? He has no self-confidence. He has no proud confidence in his own race. Because the white man destroyed your and my past, destroyed our knowledge of our culture. And by having destroyed it, now we don't know we have any achievements, any accomplishments. And as long as you can be convinced that you never did anything, you can never do anything.
MLK is still honored and remembered today for his idealism and devotion to his morals. His teachings centered upon three main ideas of nonviolence, love, and cooperation. Individually, these were powerful lessons, but when combined under the leadership of Reverend King, they created an even more impactful movement.
Nonviolence, as MLK preached it, directed blacks to resist the impulse to lash out and lower themselves to the hateful level of their oppressors. He strongly believed that violence is poisonous, only begets more violence, and would ultimately hurt their cause. He organized peaceful protests, best known of which were the Montgomery bus boycotts and public sit-ins as organized by the SCLC. He summarized the effects of violence and hate by saying, "Men must see that force begets force, hate begets hate, toughness begets toughness." and it is all a descending spiral, ultimately ending in destruction for all and everybody.
Closely linked with the idea of nonviolence was the idea of love. MLK taught that only through love could the nature of society be changed. He said, "It is love that will save our world and our civilization. Love, even for enemies." So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for love or for hate? He maintained, love is the most durable power in the world. Clearly this was a difficult lesson to sell, to try and convince a race, long oppressed and mistreated, to show love and compassion to the very people responsible for their suffering. But even so, he persevered and maintained this as one of his central ideologies.
Finally, he believed that blacks should cooperate with those whites who were willing to help. He urged blacks not to hold a grudge, nor to treat all whites as the enemy. He recognized that only with their help could they achieve change.
Malcolm X is also heralded as a determined advocate for civil rights, but his ideologies conflicted strongly with those of MLK. He believed in change by any means necessary, which meant he felt no moral restrictions to the use of violence or other drastic measures. He was far more militant and violent, both physically and intellectually.
Malcolm X was known for his militancy. As opposed to MLK, he was willing to resort to violence to defend his rights. He felt that the whites had been suppressing the blacks for too long and that it was time to fight back. His troubled childhood and his headstrong nature culminated to produce his militant regiments. During a speech, he exclaimed, "Be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery." Malcolm was willing to kill and die for his rights. He even said, "If you're not willing to die for it, take the word freedom out of your vocabulary." Freedom was essential to Malcolm. Thus, he said it as equally important to his own life. Malcolm stressed that it would take more than nonviolence to erase all the racism that had been established in the United States.
The conflict between MLK and Malcolm X resulted from their fundamentally different approaches to gaining equality. It was essentially a showdown between MLK's strict adherence to moral means and Malcolm X's by any means necessary. This manifested itself in the differences of love versus hate, violence versus nonviolence, and whether or not the ends justify the means. Their individual philosophies were best shown through the speeches they gave, in which each passionately defended and advocated their views. At various points, they even came into direct conflict and discussion over each other's movement.
Reverend Martin Luther King preaches a doctrine of nonviolent insistence upon the rights of the American Negro. What is your attitude toward this philosophy?
The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. That's what you mean by nonviolent. Be defenseless. Be defenseless in the face of one of the most cruel beasts that has ever taken the people into captivity. That's this American white man.
But I think of love as something strong and that organizes itself into powerful direct action. This is what I tried to teach in the struggle in the South, that we are not engaged in a struggle that means we sit down and do nothing. That there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance.
Come together right now over me.
Race, from the beginning, was a contentious and volatile issue which engendered strong feelings in all walks of people. There were whites and blacks alike that disliked or mistrusted both MLK and Malcolm X. However, the obvious differences between these two leaders helped attract an overall broader base of support for their common goal. MLK appealed to moderates and reformist whites, and Malcolm X to the more extremist and militant black nationalists. For those who didn't think much of nonviolence, Malcolm X was a refreshing change. And to those who were scared or intimidated by the militancy of the other side, MLK seemed to welcome moderate. The truth was that their differences ultimately were their greatest strength. It may appear, and for a while may have been, that the inner conflict weakened the overall cause. But in the end, they served as devil's advocate to each other to streamline and improve each ideology. Ultimately, not only did their differences benefit the cause, but each side softened and compromised somewhat. Together, a thesis and antithesis, they created a new synthesis and spearheaded the civil rights campaign for eventual